Isso eu apresento.
Miss Aline, you may start.
Boa noite, bem-vindos novamente a todos e a todas a essa sessão de encerramento do segundo colóquio em Filosofia Patrística e Medieval da Pontifícia Universidade Católica de São Paulo. Então, em nome de sua comissão organizadora, eu gostaria de agradecer a presença de todas as pessoas que apresentaram comunicações ao longo do evento e de todos que nos acompanharam aqui pelo Zoom e pelo YouTube. Então, para essa sessão de encerramento, eu gostaria de agradecer primeiro, mais uma vez, ao Centro de Estudos Agostinianos, à editora Paulus e à Pastoral Universitária da Pontifícia Universidade Católica de São Paulo, que apoiaram e deram suporte técnico e tudo ao evento. E agora vamos passar, então, a essa conferência de encerramento do professor Claude Panaccio, que é professor emérito da da Universidade do Québec, em Montreal, e membro da Sociedade Real do Canadá. Eu acho que não é exagero dizer que o professor Claude Panaccio é um dos maiores especialistas mundiais de filosofia medieval da atualidade, e seus temas de pesquisa estão centrados principalmente em Guilherme de Ockham e nominalismo, e também a questão da filosofia da linguagem, lógica e filosofia da mente contemporâneas. Entre livros e artigos, o Panaccio publicou centenas de coisas, inclusive artigos traduzidos para o português, então ele tem publicações em francês, em inglês, em português, e dentre as suas publicações eu destaco principalmente alguns livros, então que é Le Discours Antérieur, de Platon a Guillaume d'Ockham, que foi publicado em 1999, e que está traduzido para o inglês, com o título de Mental Language from Plato to William of Ockham, para quem tem interesse. Um outro livro que acho que foi bastante usado por muitos de nós no Brasil, que é Les mots, les concepts et les choses, la sémantique de Guillaume d'Ockham. E, mais recentemente, dois outros livros que eu tenho aqui, Qu'est-ce qu'un concept? E Récit et reconstruction des fondements de la méthode en histoire de la philosophie, que foi publicado em 2019. Como eu disse, eu poderia passar ainda horas falando sobre o currículo do professor Panaccio, mas eu deixo que sua apresentação fale por si só. Ele que foi, inclusive, colega do professor Carlos Arthur Ribeiro do Nascimento, nosso homenageado aqui ao longo dessa semana. Então, sem me alongar muito, eu passo a palavra ao professor Claude Panaccio. You have the floor for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Aline. I am sorry that I cannot speak Portuguese. Well, I'll speak English. First, I would like to thank very warmly the organizers of this conference for having invited me to be part of this celebration. I am very honored by it, and I am also extremely pleased. Carlos Arthur and I, we were students together at the Institute of Medieval Studies of the University of Montreal in the late 1960s and early 70s. That is more than 50 years ago. I remember most vividly, for example, a wonderful seminar on Roger Bacon that was given in Montreal in the fall of 1967 by Professor Jean Gagné, who was at the time Carlos Arthur's supervisor for his MA dissertation and later on for his PhD dissertation as well. And if I remember correctly, Carlos Arthur gave a paper in this seminar on Roger Bacon's theory of optics. This later became the subject of his PhD dissertation. So I can say I was right there, when Carlos Arthur began to be interested in Roger Bacon. Since that time, I have had the pleasure of giving a number of lectures in Brazil on several occasions, the first of which was in 1988, as I acted as invited professor at Unicamp. And during my stay in Campinas, Carlos Sartor arranged to have me invited to give a lecture at the Pontifical Institute, at the Pontifical University of Sao Paulo. And on this occasion, Carlos Sartor and his wife Fatima took me around Sao Paulo for a very lively introduction to the city, along with their 3 sons. And I later had other occasions to visit Carlos Sartor and Fatima in Sao Paulo, in this very cozy house of them right between 2 very tall apartment buildings. Those are great souvenirs for which I'm very grateful to Carlos Sartor and Fatima. In short, I am extremely happy today to be part of this well-deserved celebration of Carlos Sartor's impressive career. Now, the topic I chose to discuss with you is William of Ockham's theory of substance, and especially of material substance. The idea of substance, as you know very well, has been crucial in the whole history of Western philosophy from Aristotle on, and it is still actively debated in contemporary analytic philosophy. And of course, the idea of substance was especially salient in late medieval philosophy, given the importance of Aristotle's thought in this period. What I will do here is first briefly recall some well-known features of Ockham's theory of substance. Second, I will outline what I call the tropist reading of Ockham's ontology that I have put forward in a couple of previous papers. And third, I will especially focus on the idea of substratum in Ockham. This is what is new in this lecture, by the way. I have never discussed this point, substratum, in Ockham before, either in print or in public lecture. And as far as I know, it's not been much dealt with in the secondary literature either. Okay, so first, let me recall 3 well-known features of Ockham's theory of substance: hylomorphism, nominalism, and the doctrine of the plurality of forms. Hylomorphism, as you well know, is the doctrine inherited from Aristotle, that a substance, a material substance especially, is composed of 2 kinds of basic elements: matter on one hand and form on the other hand. Now, Ockham clearly subscribes to this doctrine. Matter and form for him are the essential parts of a singular material substance, such as a human being, a tree, or a snowbank for that matter. Well, I'm aware that maybe some of you are not that familiar with snowbanks, but anyway, those are substances too. The point is that any material substance is a complex being. It is intrinsically composed of form and matter. A material substance, then, is not an indeterminate substratum for properties. It has an internal structure of its own, a part-whole structure, actually, a mereological structure, with matter and form, or forms, as its parts. And these parts are essential parts for Ockham. This means that should any one of them be missing, the substance is destroyed. It does not exist anymore. In adopting hylomorphism, Ockham, in effect, also subscribes to a variety of essentialism. The second well-known feature of Occam's theory of substance that I want to mention is that it is a nominalist theory with respect to universals. Only singular things exist for Occam. In the theory of substance, this means not only that each substance is a singular being, but also that each essential part of a substance is a singular being. Each substantial form, in particular, is a singular being. There is no such thing as a common form that would be individualized or individuated by matter. Occam subscribes to what is called today in metaphysics the doctrine of primitivist individuation. Each being is individuated by itself. There is no point, therefore, for Occam in looking for a principle of individuation, such as in Aquinas or Duns Scotus, precisely because every being is an individual from the start. And this holds as well for the chunk of matter that is an essential part of a given substance. The matter of a given horse is a singular being, an actual singular being. Matter is not pure potentiality for Occam. If it was, Occam argues, it could not be a part of anything. Any part of an actually existent being must actually exist as well. How could anything, Occam rhetorically asks, have a non-being as one of its parts? Occam's nominalism in the theory of substance, then, is that each substance is a singular being and each essential part of a substance is an actual singular being as well, be it a form or a chunk of matter. The third salient and well-known feature of Occam's theory of substance that I want to recall is that Occam subscribes to the doctrine of the plurality of substantial forms. There was a lively debate in the 13th and 14th century about whether human beings, in particular, have only one substantial form or several substantial forms. Aquinas, for one, was a Unitarianist in this respect, and so was John Buridan, for example. But Occam sides with the pluralists, along with several other Franciscans, including John Duns Scotus most notably. For Occam, any animal in particular has at least two substantial forms among its intrinsic essential parts, in addition to matter. It has a corporeal form that determines the kind of body it has, and a sensory form that provides it with a certain kind of sensitivity, the sensitivity of a horse, for example, or the sensitivity of a rabbit, so on. The argument here is the cadaver argument. Consider the body of a dead horse. It can retain its original color for a while. But singular qualities, such as the color of a certain thing, are not transferable from one substratum to another, according to Occam. The substratum of the color quality, then, must remain the same when the horse is dead as when it was alive. Since the horse is dead, however, some essential part of it must have been destroyed. It follows that when the horse was alive, there was at least two distinct substantial forms within its singular substance, a corporeal form and a sensory form. Sensory form it dies when the horse dies, but the corporeal form remains for a while as the substratum of color, for example. Human beings, for Ockham, even have a third substantial form, namely an intellectual or an intellective form. His argument for this being that contrary acts cannot coexist on the same substratum, but a human being can intellectually will something that she does not sensitively desire, or conversely. The intellectual substratum then must differ from the sensory substantial form in human beings. As you can see, these arguments in favor of the plurality of substantial forms crucially make use of a certain idea of a substratum. So I'll return to this later on. For the time being, I don't want to dwell further upon the three features of Ockham's theory of substance that I have listed so far, but it is important to keep them in mind. Ockham subscribes to hyomorphism and consequently to a certain form of mereological essentialism with respect to material substances. He is a nominalist with respect to universals. Only singular things exist. Substantial forms and chunks of matters, consequently, are all of them singular beings. And he subscribes to the doctrine of the plurality of substantial forms, at least in the case of living beings. Now, in a couple of previously published papers, I have proposed a tropist reconstruction of Ockham's ontology. One paper in French in 2008, L'ontologie d'Ockham et la théorie des tropes. This is in a volume in honor of Alain de Libera, titled Complément de substance, advent. And more recently, a paper in English, Ockham's ontology, published in 2015 at Routledge, in a volume entitled Nominalism about Properties, edited by Ghislain Guigon and Gonzalo Rodriguez Pereira. The term trope, as I use it in this context, was proposed in 1953 by the American philosopher D.C. Williams in a famous paper entitled The Elements of Being. A trope, in Williams' sense, is a singular instance of a property. Not redness in general, for example, but a certain patch of redness. The singular redness of this particular flower, for example. Now beware, this is not to be confused with a certain shade of redness. Each redness trope is a singular being, spatio-temporally located. The redness trope of this flower might be, perceptually undistinguishable from the redness trope of that other flower, but they are two distinct tropes. Anyway, in contemporary metaphysics, a radical trope ontology is the doctrine according to which everything in the world is ultimately composed of tropes, in this sense. In this perspective, a concrete object, such as a horse, a flower, or a snowbank for that matter, is nothing but a bundle of tropes, a concatenation of several singular property instances. There have been a number of, and there still are a number of distinguished proponents of radical trope ontology in recent metaphysics, including D.C. Williams, of course, but also Keith Campbell, Anna-Sophia Maurin, or Douglas Ehring, among others. Now, my contention is that the whole of Ockham's ontology can be seen as a variety of radical trope ontology. As is well known, Ockham's ontology admits only substances on the one hand, along with their essential parts, and qualities on the other hand. There are no relations and no quantities as distinct entities in Occam's world. Yet substances are not the only things that exist. There are some but also. Now, it is quite controversial, I believe, that Occam's qualities are, in D.C. Williams' sense, they are singular entities that are superadded to singular substances, such as the singular redness of a singular flower or the singular heat of a singular fire. Remember, Occam is a nominalist. There are no general properties in his ontology. Yet there are qualities that are really distinct from substances. These qualities, therefore, are all of them singular. That is to say, they are all of them tropes in today's sense. Okay, but what about substances? Qualities in Occam are not intrinsic parts of substances. They are externally attached to substances. What might be controversial about a radical tropist interpretation of Occam's ontology is whether substances can be seen as intrinsically composed of tropes. The point of the tropist interpretation is that, yes, Occam's substances can legitimately be seen as intrinsically composed of tropes. In other words, the claim is that the essential parts of a substance in Occam's ontology are or can be seen as tropes in the sense of today's metaphysics. For today's trope theorists, tropes are, and I quote D.C. Williams, incomplete or partial entities. They do not move around separately in the world. They exist only as internal constituents of concrete objects. In this view, concrete particulars, as Douglas Ehring writes in his 2014 book, Tropes, titled the book, Tropes, he writes, concrete particulars are mereological wholes. They're entirely made up of tropes. And these tropes are connected by a relation of compresence. This is the term that modern trope theorists typically use. This means that the tropes that constitute a given concrete particular occupy the same place at the same time. They spatio-temporally go along with one another. And compresence, Ehring says, is, and I quote, generally understood not to be an internal relation, but an external relation, end of quote. This means that for any given trope, it is not absolutely necessary that it be compresent with a certain other one. Okay, so let me sum up. Tropes in today's sense, one, are incomplete entities. Second, they are the internal constituents of concrete particulars in such a way that a given concrete particular is nothing but the mereological sum of its constituent tropes. Third, the tropes that are the constituents of a given concrete particular are compresent with one another. And four, compresence is not an absolutely necessary relation among tropes. Now, this is exactly what we have in Occam with respect to the essential parts of material substances, that is, substantial forms and matter. For one thing, Occam is explicit that the essential parts of a substance are, and I quote Occam, partial entities, entitates parciales, that constitute one single whole when they're together. In the natural world, at least, a substantial form never goes around separately, at least in the material world. And neither does a chunk of matter. In the natural material world, matter and form exist only insofar as they hang up together as the parts of a singular substance, such as a horse, a flower, or a snowbank. Second, matter and substantial forms then are the internal constituents of familiar substances, according to Ockham, just as tropes are the internal constituents of concrete particulars, according to modern trope theory. And Ockham is explicit that the resulting substantial whole is nothing but its parts. Third, the matter and form of a given substance, according to Ockham, are always located in the same place, in eodem loco, he says. And if a given substance has several substantial forms, as a human being has, according to Ockham, then each form occupies exactly the very same place at the same time than each one of the other substantial forms, and the very same place as well as the matter of the singular substance in question. Put in today's vocabulary, Ockham's matter and the substantial forms of a given substance are compresent. Note that this implies that form and matter are the parts of a particular substance in a very different way that the one in which the head and the legs of a horse, say, can be said to be parts of the horse. In the medieval vocabulary, the head and the legs of a horse were labeled as integral parts of the horse. And while they usually move along with one another, of course, they're not located at the very same place. The head is at one end, the horse, the legs are behind the horse. The essential parts of a singular substance, by contrast, are parts of this substance in a very special way, according to Ockham, since they all occupy the very same place. You don't have one part set a certain place and another part another place. And this is exactly what we have in contemporary trope theory as well. The tropes are said to be parts of concrete particulars, but in the same very special way as matter and form are parts of substance in Ockham's dilomorphism. They occupy the very same place at the same time. And finally, we have seen that compresence among tropes is not an absolutely necessary relation according to contemporary trope theory, nor is the compresence of matter and form in Ockham's metaphysics. In the natural world, of course, matter and form stick together, but this is not absolutely necessary. God can supernaturally separate them by his absolute power, according to Ockham, just as God can supernaturally separate the qualities of the bread from the substance of the bread in the Eucharist. Ockham's God can separate a given substantial form from the matter it normally goes along with. Okay, so Ockham's theory of material substances comes out as a variety of trope theory in today's sense. It is a special variety. However, since not all tropes are on a par in Ockham's view, for each material substance, there are accidental tropes on the one hand the qualities of the substance, and essential tropes, on the other hand, namely matter and substantial forms. This is what the British philosopher Peter Simons has called a nuclear theory of tropes. Peter Simons did not have Ockham in mind at all when he proposed this label in a 1994 paper entitled Particulars in Particular Clothing, 3 Trope Theories of Substance. But the description Simon gives of a nuclear theory of tropes smoothly applies to Ockham. In a nuclear theory of tropes, in Simon's sense, we have 2 levels of tropes for any given particular substance. First, there is what Simons describes as, and I quote him, an essential kernel or nucleus of the substance. End of quote. That is a bundle of tropes that taken together form, and I quote again, the individual essence or an individual nature of a substance. End of quote. And this nucleus is then supplemented by what Simons calls accidental tropes. Now, this is exactly what we have in Ockham. The essential parts of the substance on the one hand, and its accidental qualities on the other hand, all of them being tropes in today's sense. Now, admittedly, this kind of nuclear trope theory is not as simple as a standard trope theory is. In standard trope theory, compresence is the sole basic relation among tropes. And it is sometimes thought to be an advantage of the theory that it is so simple. But actually, this is too simple. A distinction really seems to be required between the essential and the accidental features of any given concrete particular. And this is what a nuclear theory of tropes allows for, as we clearly see in Ockham, where the matter and form are the internal essential parts of the substance, while quality tropes are taken to be externally attached to the substance. The tropist interpretation of Ockham then sounds quite plausible, at least to me, and it allows for interesting and illuminating connections with contemporary discussions in metaphysics. There is a problem, though. In recent literature, radical trope theories of substance are often contrasted with what is called substratum theories of substance, according to which the concrete substance is a substratum with respect to its properties. The problem is that Occam's theory of substance does leave room for the notion of substratum. We are thus led to wonder about this feature of Occam's theory. What role does the notion of a substratum play exactly in Occam's theory of substance? And is Occam's notion of a substratum compatible or not with the tropist reading of Occam's theory of substance? To clarify this, let us look first at Occam's terminology on this matter. Occam does not use the Latin term substratum in this context, but he frequently uses subjectum in contexts in which it can be translated by substratum in modern philosophical jargon. So we use a Latin anglicized term, substratum, to translate Occam's subjectum. In several passages, Occam explains that the term subjectum has 2 completely different senses in philosophy. We can either speak, he says, of the subject of a proposition, subjectum propositionis, or the subject of a thing, subjectum rei. In the first sense of subjectum, what we have is a logical or grammatical notion. The subject, in this sense, is a term within a proposition, be it a spoken proposition, a mental proposition, or a written proposition for that matter. What is of interest to us here is the other sense, a subject is informed, informata, by another thing, and that underlies or supports this other thing. Sustentans eam. It stands, that's the image, it stands underneath the other thing, and it serves as a support for it. In this sense, subjectum can be translated indeed as substratum in today's philosophical English, and this is what I will be doing. Okay, but what role does this notion of ontological substratum or subjectum play in Ockham's theory of substance? Basically, it is used to indicate the relation of a substance to its qualities. Take a red rose, for example. We have two distinct things here, according to Ockham's theory. A substance on the one hand, which is the rose itself, and a quality on the other hand, which is the redness of the rose. Those are two distinct things. And both of them, of course, are singular things. They are individuals. The redness trope in this case is said to inhere in the rose, but it is not an intrinsic part of the rose. It is something external to the rose, which is accidentally attached to it. The rose in this case is said to be the substratum, or subjectum, of this singular redness. And this is generalizable. Any singular substance is the substratum of its singular accidental qualities in Ockham's theory of substance. But there are other ontological connections in Ockham's theory of substance where the idea of a substratum also enters the game. For one thing, a substantial form rather than the substance as a whole is sometimes said by Ockham to be the primary substratum, primum subjectum, of certain qualities. The primary substratum or primary subject of a quality is defined by Ockham as that which is such that there is no part of it that is not informed by this quality. Take a black horse, say, with a yellow mane. The primary subject of the yellowness trope in this case is not the horse as a whole, but the mane, because there are other parts of the horse that are not yellow. A primary substratum then does not have to be a whole substance. It can be a part of a substance. It can be an integral part of the substance, such as the mane is with respect to the horse. But in Ockham's vocabulary, the primary subject or primary substratum of a quality can also be a substantial form, not only an integral part, substantial form of the substance. That is an essential part of the substance. This occurs most notably in cases where a substance has several substantial forms. An act of thought, for example, is a quality in Ockham's ontology. And the human being who produces this act of thought is the substratum of this act of thought. But the human being cannot be said to be the primary subject of the act of thought, for there are parts, even essential parts, of the human being that are not thinking when a human being thinks, namely his body and his sensory soul. In such a case, the intellectual soul of the human being is said by Ockham to be the primary subject or substratum of the act of thought. Since the intellectual soul is one of the substantial forms of a human being for Ockham, it is this substantial form, in this case, that is considered as the primary substratum of a certain quality, namely the act of thought. And there is yet another connection, a third one, in Ockham's theory of substance, for which he sometimes uses the term subjectum, substratum. It is the connection between matter and form. The matter of a material substance is said by Ockham to receive, recipere, the substantial form or substantial forms. There are several of them. In his Summula of Natural Philosophy, Book 1, Chapter 9, Ockham says that the matter of a material substance is a certain actual entity that is connected with substantial forms in pretty much the same way as a substantial substratum is connected with the various qualities that it receives or can successively receive. Matter, then, can be considered as the substratum of the substantial forms. What we have then in Ockham's theory of substance are three connections where something is said to be a substratum for something else. First, a substance with respect to its qualities. Second, a substantial form with respect to some qualities. In this case, Ockham speaks of the primary subject of these qualities. And third, matter with respect to substantial forms. How much of a problem is this for the tropist interpretation of Ockham's theory of substance that I have been advocating? Prima facie, it seems to be a problem because, radical trope theories are often contrasted in recent analytic philosophy with substratum theories. The contrast is said to be the following. In radical trope theories, concrete objects are mere bundles of properties, each one of which is called a trope. While in substratum theories, the properties of a concrete object are attached to a common underlying substratum. Okay, well, we must now take a closer look at the question. In the so-called substratum theories, as opposed to trope theories, the substratum is usually taken to have a number of distinctive features. And these, as we will see, are mostly irrelevant in the framework of Ockham's theory of substance. The Swedish philosopher Gustav Bergman is often identified as one of the main promoters of the substratum theory of substance as opposed to the trope theory or bundle theory. Now, what I take to be the two main features of the substratum in Bergman's view are the following. First, it is an ontological individuator. And second, and even more importantly, it is the bearer of all the properties, and therefore it is intrinsically indeterminate. This is the theory of what is usually called the bare particular in recent discussions, or the thin particular in the terminology of the Australian metaphysician David Armstrong. Let me take these two features successively. In Gustav Bergmann's view, the substratum is supposed to be the individuator of properties. But this makes sense only for someone who is a realist with respect to universals, as Bergmann indeed was. For Ockham, there is simply no need for an individuator of properties. Ockham, as we saw, subscribed to what is called today primitivist individuation. Every real being is individual by itself. There is no something, there is no such thing as the general property of redness that would be individuated in particular substances by some individuating factor. And there is no such thing either as a common human nature that would be individuated in particular human beings by some individuating factor, as in Duns Scotus, for example. So whatever role it plays in Occam's theory, the substratum is not an individuator for properties. What about its being the bearer of all properties, and consequently its being intrinsically indeterminate? This is the main feature of the ontological substratum, according to the substratum theories of substance, insofar as they are contrasted with trope theories. But this is not what we have in Occam. To see it, let us review the three connections where the notion of a substratum plays a role in Occam's ontology, as I established earlier. Substance with respect to qualities, substantial forms with respect to qualities, and matter with respect to substantial forms. First then, the substance is taken to be the substratum for qualities. This is absolutely standard, of course, in Aristotelian metaphysics, but a substance for Occam is not, of course, an indeterminate entity. It is not at all a bare particular in today's sense. It has an internal structure. Material substances in particular have an internal structure. They have intrinsic essential parts. And the substance is not the substratum of its essential parts. It is composed of them. And this is entirely different. A human being, for example, is not to be thought of as a bare particular serving as a substratum for a human nature. A human being is intrinsically a human being. The substance is a substratum for its accidental qualities, which are ontologically distinct from this substance, but it is not a substratum for anything like essential properties. Whatever is essential to a substance is intrinsic to it. Occam's substance, in short, are not bare particulars. What about substantial forms? We have seen that certain substantial forms are described by Occam as the primary subjects or substrata for certain qualities. But substantial forms are not bare particulars either. An intellectual substantial form, for instance, is an intellect, a singular intellect. And as such, it can survive separately after the death of the body. The sensory substantial form, by contrast, does not survive the death of the body, yet it is not a bare particular either. It is a certain singular sensitivity. Substantial forms are not bare particulars. The third case, that is the case of matter, being a substratum for substantial forms, comes closer to the notion of a bare particular. Indeed, in recent philosophical literature, when the notion of a bare particular is discussed, it is often compared with the Aristotelian idea of prime matter. Aristotelian prime matter is often understood as an intrinsically indeterminate substratum. But we're talking about Ockham here. In Ockham, what he calls pure matter is not pure potentiality. Any chunk of matter is an actual entity. This is something he often repeats, and he insistently argues for it. See, particularly the Summula Philosophiae Naturalis, Book 1, Chapter 9 and 10, very clear discussion of this. Matter for Ockham does not receive its being from substantial forms. It is a distinct, actual entity by itself, and it has a number of distinctive properties by itself. It is naturally unengenderable. It is naturally indestructible, and above all, it is extended by itself. That is, it has parts outside of parts by itself. An extension, spatial extension, is not a property of which matter would be the indeterminate substratum. Matter is not a substratum with respect to extension. It is intrinsically extended. I quote, matter, Ockham writes, is quantified by itself, and it is dimensioned, dimensionata, by itself. End of quote. It is spatially located in loco by itself. Although he does not explicitly say so, Ockham is strongly committed to the idea that God could, by his absolute power, keep a chunk of pure matter in existence without any substantial or accidental form. Occam's pure matter, in short, is not intrinsically indeterminate either, and no particular chunk of matter is a bare particular in the sense in which the substratum of properties is supposed to be a bare particular in today's so-called substratum theories of substance, insofar as they are opposed to radical trope theories. So my conclusion is the following: that there is room for the idea of substratum in Occam's theory of substance does not jeopardize the tropist reconstruction of Occam's ontology. Even the matter of a particular substance can be seen as a trope, actually. Of course, one question remains: what role exactly does the idea of substratum play in Occam's theory of substance? Very briefly, let me say two things about that. First, the idea of substratum in Occam allows for more ontological structure than many contemporary standard trope theories do. In standard trope theories, a concrete object is seen as a mere bundle of compresent tropes. Occam, by contrast, admits of more ontological structure by distinguishing the intrinsic essential parts of the substance and its extrinsic accidental qualities. As I've said earlier, insofar as Occam's ontology is seen as a trope theory, it must be seen not as a standard trope theory, but as a variety of nuclear trope theory in Peter Simon's sense. So this is one role of the theory of substance, of substratum, one role of the idea of substratum to allow for more ontological structure. But now the main function of Occam's idea of substratum or subjectum, as it occurs in his theory of substance is to indicate natural priority. In distinction 9, question 3 of the Ordinatio, Ockham discusses various modes of priority and posteriority. There is, for example, temporal priority, there is causal priority, and so on. One important kind of priority that Ockham acknowledges there is priority by nature, natura. I quote, "That which is prior by nature, prius natura, is that which can exist without the posterior, but not conversely." This is priority by nature. And thus he says, and I quote again, "Matter is prior by nature with respect to form, and the subject, subjectum, is prior by nature with respect to the accident." This very exactly covers the 3 cases where the idea of substratum plays a role in Ockham's theory of substance: matter with respect to substantial forms, substance with respect to accidental qualities, and also substantial forms with respect to qualities, so far as a certain substantial form is said by Ockham to be the primary subject of certain qualities. So my final proposal is the following: saying that something is the substratum of another thing in Ockham, especially in Ockham's theory of substance, is to say a number of things. That these two singular things are intimately connected in the ontology, that they are distinct things. Nothing is substratum for itself. And none of them is a part of the other. Neither a part is a substratum for the whole, nor the whole a substratum for the part in Ockham's vocabulary. And third, that the former, that is the substratum, is prior by nature with respect to the other one. This result, I take it, significantly enriches the tropist interpretation of Ockham's ontology that I have been proposing in previous publications, but it is entirely compatible with it. A concrete object in Ockham's view is made up of 2 kinds of tropes: essential tropes and accidental tropes, the former being prior by nature with respect to the latter. And essential tropes are themselves of 2 basic kinds: matter, or chunks of matter, and substantial forms. The former, that is matter, being prior by nature with respect to the latter. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. We will now open for questions. Então, vamos abrir as perguntas. Fiquem à vontade de fazer perguntas diretamente para o Claude Panaccio em inglês ou em francês, ou, se vocês preferirem, façam em português e eu posso fazer a tradução. Mesmo para as pessoas que estão nos acompanhando pelo YouTube, fiquem à vontade também para escrever suas perguntas em português e a gente vai ajudar na mediação. Claude, I was just saying that people could ask you questions, I assume, both in English and French.
I got it.
Since no one has manifested themselves, maybe I will kick off the discussion, if I may. So I was wondering if I understood your conclusion properly, that this idea that you presented of the notion of substratum in Ockham, so it accounts for this, as if I understood it correctly, it accounts for the similar issues that you have dealt with earlier, so in other papers. And it also has the advantage, and this is where I'm not too sure about. It also has the advantage of providing an account that is in tune with those three notions that you begin with. So hylomorphism, nominalism, and the plurality of forms. Or does it have more of an advantage explanatorily to one of those three aspects of Ockham's philosophy?
Yes, well, the tropist theory, as I proposed it earlier, was already clearly compatible with the three features. And I had, it was compatible with hylomorphism since there are substantial forms and matter. It was a nominalist theory since everything in it are singular. Actually, radical trope theories are often described as nominalist theories because, with respect to universals, precisely because everything in these theories is taken to be singular. It was, since there are several substantial forms, it was compatible with that because there are, the point was precisely that there are several tropes within the substance. The difference with standard trope theory was that it's a nuclear theory. It distinguishes between accidental tropes, external tropes, and internal tropes. Now, what is new with studying the role of the idea of substratum is, for one thing, I replied to an objection, a possible objection, saying, well, cannot be really, a trope theory because there is so much room that Ockham gives to the idea of substratum. And substratum theories, as well known, are different from trope theories. So this is one thing. And I try to show that the role that Ockham gives to the idea of a substratum is very different from the role that is given to the idea of a substratum in substratum theories of substance insofar as they are contrasted with trope theories. So that's a negative aspect, so to say. But there is a positive aspect. I mean, the considering Ockham's theory as a tropist theory, a theory of tropes, invites us to wonder about exactly what is the role of the idea of a substratum there. And I think this is interesting. I mean, this the part that is really new. There is a role that this notion of substratum plays. For one thing, it gives structure, but this I already had covered, but it completes the picture, so to say. But also what it especially indicates is natural priority. It indicates that, matter is naturally prior to substantial forms. Substantial forms are naturally prior to qualities, and substance as a whole is naturally prior to qualities. And that is the role that the idea of substratum really plays. So the picture of something, underneath is just a picture. It's just, figurative representation. There's nothing underneath. There's no spatial connection between matter and form. They all occupy the same place. And there's no spatial underlying relation between substance and qualities. Qualities are exactly in the same place as the substance is. So the relation of being a substratum is not really explained by the idea of underlying or being underneath or supporting. The real point for Ockham, and this I think is an interesting result of having a tropist reading, is that what is indicated by the relation of being a substratum is natural priority.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We have one question from Rodrigo Guerizoli that is watching us from YouTube. So he is asking about how Ockham thinks of substance as an individual that nevertheless seems to be the product of the sum of two other individuals. So how do you think Ockham would answer the objection? And then I'm quoting Rodrigo saying here, well, it seems that you want 1 + 1 to result not in 2, but in 1. And that is, to say the least, strange.
No, but that is exactly what Ockham thinks. A substance is made up of, actually, it's a bit worse than that, but because some substances are made up not of 2 constituents, but of 3 or 4 constituents, namely matter and 1, 2, or 3 substantial forms. But all of these together make up a whole that constitutes what Ockham calls a unity per se. It's not all concatenation of different things together that make a unity per se. I was listening to Ernesto Perini Santos this afternoon. He was talking about armies. Armies are aggregate of things, namely soldiers, but an army is not a unity per se. It's just a collection of soldiers arranged in a certain way. Nevertheless, it's not the same at all with substances for Ockham. Substances has parts, and it is composed of various parts that together make up for a unity per se. They naturally constitute a unified thing. This exists. We have a similar situation in the case of qualities. Qualities can be complex. For example, a very intense degree of whiteness, or a whiteness of a very intense degree, is composed for Ockham of different whitenesses that occupy the same place. And as different whitenesses pile up together in the same place, the whiteness of a horse, say, becomes more and more vivid, so to say. So we have here unity per se, a thing that is 1 per se, 1 whiteness, that is a complex thing. So some things that are 1 per se are complex. Not all things that are 1 per se are simple, far from that. But to dissolve the strangeness, the apparent strangeness of 1 + 1 makes 1, it's not the same kind of ones, you know. 1 chunk of matter plus 1 or 2 or 3 substantial forms make up not for a new chunk of matter, but for a substance. This at least dissolves the strangeness in this case, but it does not maybe in the case of qualities, because in the case of qualities, one quality of let's say whiteness trope plus 1 other whiteness trope make up 1 more intense whiteness trope, and not 2 whiteness tropes. 1 more intense with different parts. So this is how things are in Ockham's theory, right?
Thank you again. And if Rodrigo has follow-up questions, I think he will post them. So thank you, Rodrigo, for your question. Happy to have you with us on YouTube. Okay, so we have a question on the chat.
Sim, senhor.
Diga, professor. Professor Calzato?
No, Caesar has a question.
Sim. Sim. So Cesar has a question. I'm going to read it just to be clear for everyone. Matter and form are united in material substances. What is this union itself? Another entity? And the union between qualities and substance?
The answer, Ockham's answer is no. There is the union is not a third entity. There is no, in particular, Ockham argues against the idea of the forma totius, that was proposed by Scotus or a certain number of other authors. A whole such as a complex material substance has various parts, but these parts together do not need the existence of a relation. So one of Ockham's central intuition in metaphysics is that things can be related in certain ways without the relation being an additional third entity or an additional small entity, as he says, parvares, a little thing in addition to the things that are related. This is especially true for spatial relations. For example, if Paul, let's say, stands at the left of Mary, being at the left of is nothing real. It is real, it is true that Paul is standing at the left of Mary. This is objectively and mind independently true, but being at the left of is not a real entity in addition to Paul and Mary. And if Mary moves to the left of Paul, then no additional entity is created in the world and no pre-existing entity is destroyed. They just change place. So this is a central intuition. I think it's a very deep intuition that things can be related in certain ways without another entity needing to exist. And this is the case, particularly the case of matter and form. The union of matter and form is not a third thing. Ockham wonders if compresence is sufficient, and he thinks that if we were in a purely Aristotelian world, yes. I mean, when a form and a matter are in the same place, then the form informs that matter. They make up for a substance. But God could arrange things otherwise. He could arrange things so that the matter and form be in the same place, but the matter does not inform, the form does not inform this chunk of matter. He does that by creating a new entity, in this case, which is a stopper. But this is a very special supernatural case. In natural cases, we don't need extra entities, but the form and the matter.
Claude, est-ce que je pourrais te poser une question en français?
Absolument, oui, bien sûr.
Parce que mon anglais est pire encore que le français. Alors, certains auteurs attribuent à la substance trois fonctions. Elle est un substrat, un sujet. Elle est subsistante par soi-même et elle est dotée d'une certaine nature. Elle est une res nature. Alors, tu as parlé surtout de la fonction de substance, de sujet. Et aucun ne parle pas de la subsistance et de la res nature.
Oui, il le fait, c'est-à-dire que la substance subsiste par elle-même au sens où elle est indépendante. Donc, c'est la priorité naturelle. Elle n'est pas ontologiquement dépendante de ces accidents dans le monde naturel, tandis que les accidents dans le monde naturel sont dépendants de la substance. Donc, l'idée de subsistance par soi, je crois, revient à deux choses chez Ockham, l'unité per se, unité par soi, d'une part, et la priorité naturelle, la priorité par nature par rapport aux accidents. Quant à l'idée d'avoir une nature, ben oui, ça c'est ce que j'ai essayé d'expliquer en disant que la substance n'est pas un substrat indéterminées, intrinsèquement indéterminées. Même les formes substantielles ne sont pas intrinsèquement indéterminées. Elles ont une nature, non pas dans le sens où il y a une nature commune qui
Oui.
s'individue ou s'incarne ou se contracte, comme dirait Scott, dans l'individu, mais elles ont quand même une certaine nature. La substance de Carlos Sartor do Nascimento est d'être un humain. Et c'est la nature interne. Ce n'est pas une propriété dont Carlos Sartor est le substrat, c'est ce qu'il est lui-même. Et la forme substantielle intellective de Carlos Sartor est un intellect, non pas encore une fois comme le substrat d'une propriété, mais c'est la nature de cette forme intellectuelle que d'être un intellect. Donc, effectivement, les deux autres propriétés sont là, mais tout ça dans un cadre nominaliste, c'est-à-dire qu'il n'y a que des entités singulières.
Est-ce que je n'abuse pas en posant une autre question? Non. Comment Ockham, disons, compatibilise cette pluralité de formes dans une substance? Quelle est la relation entre, disons, par exemple, la forme corporelle, la forme sensitive et la forme intellectuelle? Comment il compatibilise la présence de ces trois formes dans une même substance?
Oui, il y a eu, c'est une question intéressante historiquement parce que il y a un écrit dans la Reportatio, donc qui est un écrit de jeunesse de Ockham, dans lequel il envisage la possibilité de dire que certaines formes sont le substrat d'autres formes. Donc, c'est un autre lieu, j'en ai pas parlé tantôt parce que c'est une position qu'il a abandonnée, mais c'est un autre lieu où la notion de subjectum peut jouer un rôle. C'est-à-dire que la forme, disons qu'on a la forme corporelle et la forme sensitive. La forme corporelle étant naturellement antérieure pourrait être considérée comme le sujet de la forme sensorielle. Donc, il y a une relation plus complexe. Mais plus tard dans les Quodlibet, il dit en fait, quand on a plusieurs formes étendues, il n'y a pas de raison de dire que l'une est le substrat de l'autre. Elles peuvent être considérées comme informant toutes simultanément la matière. Donc, elles sont coprésentes dans la théorie, dans la dernière théorie, la théorie de la maturité. Les diverses formes sont coprésentes et elles informent toute la matière. Maintenant, il y a un statut particulier, évidemment, de la forme intellectuelle parce qu'elle n'est pas étendue. C'est une forme simple. Donc, elle est là, mais elle n'est pas spatialement... elle n'est pas spatialement... elle n'a pas de partie extrapartenne. Mais elle est tout de même dans le même lieu, d'une certaine façon, que les autres formes. Alors, il ne voit pas plus de difficultés de ce point de vue à dire qu'il y a plusieurs formes dans un même lieu que de dire qu'il y a une matière et une forme et des accidents dans le même lieu. Il y a plusieurs entités partielles et même plusieurs entités complètes, parce que les accidents les qualités sont des entités complètes, qui peuvent coexister dans un même lieu. Pas différentes substances. On ne peut pas avoir différentes substances dans un même lieu, mais on peut avoir différentes formes et on peut avoir des formes substantielles et une matière, et on peut avoir des qualités et des formes substantielles et une matière, tout ça dans un même lieu. Je ne sais pas si ça répond.
Merci bien.
Merci. Je vais me permettre une parenthèse pour faire un très bref résumé de ce que vous avez discuté pour les gens que nos assistent sur YouTube. Então, foram duas perguntas. A primeira pergunta sobre como esse cenário que o Claude Panaccio nos apresentou lida com a questão da subsistência da res natura do substrato E então, Claude Panaccio nos lembrou que, nessa visão, ele dá conta desses temas. Então, em relação à subsistência, a gente tem a questão da unidade em si e da prioridade que ele apresentou entre a prioridade entre, vendo aqui minhas notas, na verdade, o substrato em relação a substância em relação à quantidade, a forma substancial em relação às qualidades e a matéria em relação às formas substanciais. E em relação à res natura, no caso do Ockham, como é uma teoria nominalista, a gente vai ter uma natureza, mas que não é uma natureza comum, mas que é uma certa natureza. Então, não é um substrato intrinsecamente determinado, como as teorias contemporâneas às vezes podem fazer parecer, e também algo que não é ontologicamente independente por exemplo, das qualidades. E a segunda pergunta, que tratava da compatibilidade da pluralidade de formas, de uma pluralidade de formas em uma só coisa, o Claude Panaccio nos deu duas referências. O primeiro da Reportatio, que é um texto da Juventude de Ockham, em que ele até fala que algumas formas são substratos de outras formas. Essa é uma teoria que o Ockham abandonou com o tempo, e mais tarde a gente encontra nas questões quadribetais, os quadribet, a questão de que não há prioridade. Então, todas as formas informam a matéria de maneira copresente. É claro que ele fez um parênteses que a forma intelectual é particular, que a forma intelectual não tem extensão, mas, de todo modo, não é uma dificuldade que se haja mais de uma forma, já que essa teoria do Ockham admite a coexistência, tanto de formas e qualidades, de forma e matéria, quanto de múltiplas formas. O que ele não admite são a copresença de múltiplas substâncias, mas a copresença de formas substanciais é permitida e entra no quadro geral dessa teoria. Mais perguntas? Questions? Tem uma pergunta. I have a question in the chat. So the question, Julia Rodrigues Molinari asks, how matter can be in itself, how matter can be in itself something determined if it does not have a form?
Well, that is exactly what is special about Occam's theory of matter with respect to other ilomorphists or other medieval ilomorphists. As I said, his argument is, well, matter is an essential part of a substance, but how can anything an existing thing such as a substance have a part that is not an actual being? So matter must be an actual being, yet it is never naturally perceived by itself because it always go along with some form or other. And Occam says it cannot even be really conceived in a very precise way, because typically we conceive of things through concept of their forms. Nevertheless, as I said, a chunk of matter is something actual. It is extended by itself, and it occupies place by itself. And this must not be seen, prime matter for Occam must not be seen, as a big cake of which parts would be cut for each substance. So the chunk of matter, which is an essential part of one particular substance, is a different actual entity from a chunk of matter which is the essential part of another but distinct substance. And it can be supplemented by adding new material stuff to it, just like, water, Ockham says, can, take a volume of water. This is one substantial whole, and then you pour new water in it. So what happens is that you have the same substantial wholes, but with more water than it had before. So this is the same thing with matter. It can increase or decrease in the same way as material stuffs, such as water, do, or actually in the same way as qualities do. You just put on some more matter in it, and it makes up for an enriched material thing from the point of view of its matter. But in all these cases, matter is something. What it lacks is a substantial form. But lacking a substantial form does not mean that it is nothing. So this implies that a limited number of, actually, predication can be true without the predicate requiring a substantial form to inform something. For example, a chunk of matter is extended. Extended does not refer to actually does not refer neither to a quality nor to a substantial form. Just says that the matter has parts outside of parts. And having parts outside of parts is not something that the matter is an underlying substratum for. It's something that it is by itself. So that's difficult to say more about this, but the point is that, yes, we must abandon the idea that in order for something to actually exist, it has to have a substantial form. Matter is the counterexample to that for Ockham. And there's an argument for saying that it is an actual thing. It could not be a part if it would not be a part of nothing if it was not an actual thing.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have one more question from someone watching us on YouTube. I don't have, oh yes, Vicente Sampaio, he asks, because I don't know much about Ockham, I wonder if a Unitarian sense of being could be defined in his ontology. So
Excuse me, could you repeat, please?
Yes, if a Unitarian sense of being could be defined in
Unitarian
Ockham.
what? There's a word on this.
Sorry, Unitarian sense of being.
Sense of being, okay, yes, okay.
So if a Unitarian sense of being could be defined in Ockham's ontology, so that sophisticated nominalist distinction achieve consistency. I think maybe you think Ockham's nominalism is already sophisticated enough. Yeah, so he would like to hear just a word about it if you think it's proper too.
Yes, well, Ockham subscribes to the idea of what is usually called the univocality of being, as Duns Scotus did, for example, and other authors such as Aquinas did not. Being, of course, the verb being could have different senses. This is not what the theory of the univocality of being does not say that there is in all languages only one sense for the verb to be. It can have various senses. But the thesis is that there is one sense in which it applies to everything, including God, including substantial forms, including a chunk of matter. In other words, chunks of matter exist in the very same sense of exist as substantial form exists, a whole substance exists, God exists, and equality exists. So all these things have existence in the very same sense. That is the theory of univocality of being. Now, in addition to that, Ockham nevertheless says that nevertheless we can distinguish two senses of being that are that make up for an interesting distinction. In one sense, the verb to be means to be actually. That is, to exist in the real world, in the actual world. But there is a wider sense of to be, Ockham says, that would apply to merely possible beings. To be, then, means to be possible, or so it's a wider sense. But anyway, each of these two senses, those are different senses, but each of these two applies in the very same way to everything that it applies to. So there's no, in this sense, there is no degree of being, or there is a distinction in the nobility of beings. Some beings are more noble than others, and God most prominently more noble than any other being, and human beings are more noble than animals and so on. So there's a hierarchy of nobility, of betterness, so to say, in the world, but not a hierarchy of being. Being is the same sense for everything. How, of course, one question that can be asked in this respect is, and maybe that was in the mind of the person who raised the question, is what relation does this thesis of univocality of being have with nominalism? Of course, it can be defended without nominalism, as Scotus was a promoter of the univocality of being. But I think it is especially harmonious in the case of nominalism, since everything is singular. So everything, in a sense, is on a par, not of nobility, but ontologically on a par. That everything exists in the same sense. Everything exists as an individual, as a singular being. So I don't know if this answers what the concern that the person who raised the question had in mind.
Yes, thank you. Any more questions or comments, interventions? Well, if there are no further questions, I hope you all join me in thanking our speaker, Professor Claude Panaccio. Thank you very much again for your talk.
Thank you.
Então, obrigada, agradecendo a presença de todos e todas e a conferência do professor Claude Panaccio. E agora eu passo a palavra, now I'll just revert to Luiz Marcos, eu passo a palavra a Luiz Marcos para dar procedimento ao encerramento do evento.
Obrigado, Aline. I would like to congratulate Mr. Panaccio for the brilliant conference. Nesse momento, eu passarei a palavra ao homenageado para finalizarmos esse evento solenemente com suas palavras. Antes, eu só gostaria de transmitir publicamente um rápido agradecimento a todas e todos conferencistas que, sem titubeio, aceitaram o convite que enviamos, diga-se, tardiamente. Agradeço também todos os colegas, amigos e amigas do programa de pós-graduação em filosofia da PUC São Paulo, que colegiadamente nos apoiou de forma incondicional na realização deste evento. Agradeço todas e todos em nome do nosso coordenador do programa, Antônio José Romero Valverde. Também agradeço aos professores e professoras que gentilmente aceitaram abrilhantar nossas mesas com sua presença e palavras de homenagem ao Carlos Arthur, sendo moderadores de algumas. E agradeço muito especialmente os amigos e amigas da comissão organizadora. Nominalmente, agradeço as professoras Aline, Medeiros, Ramos, Edson Pamplona Diebe, o professor Pelaio Moreno Palácios, também pelo apoio do Centro de Estudos Agostinianos e da OSA. Agradeço nossos pós-graduandos, João Paulo da Silva, em nome do qual também agradeço o apoio da editora Paulus e dos Paulinos, e os pós-graduandos Leandro Bachega e Lucas Pereira Teixeira. Agradeço ainda nossos graduandos do nosso curso de filosofia aqui da PUC São Paulo, Pedro Zerves e Isaías Bispo de Miranda. Todos vocês, amigas e amigos da comissão organizadora, foi uma honra tê-los como parceiros. Este evento não teria sido possível sem o empenho de vocês, que assumiram não só muito responsavelmente todas as tarefas comigo, mas com galhardia. Eu passo, então, a palavra ao nosso querido homenageado, professor Carlos Arthur. A palavra é inteiramente sua.
Muito obrigado, Luiz. Eu queria, inicialmente, agradecer ao Claude, né, por estar aqui compartilhando conosco, né? E como ele disse, né, nós nos conhecemos, né, há muito tempo atrás, né, na década de 60, né? A diferença é que, naquela época, nenhum de nós tinha os cabelos brancos. Eu me lembro bem desse seminário que ele mencionou, do professor Jean Gagné. Foi a partir desse seminário, inclusive, que o Jean me sugeriu o tema da dissertação de mestrado que eu estava preparando na época, né? Me lembro também de alguns outros colegas que seguiam não só esse seminário, mas outros cursos nos quais eu também estava matriculado. No programa se fala da minha obra, e acho que, pelo que foi mencionado, pelo menos por um dos participantes desse evento, se referia, sobretudo, à minha participação na constituição do departamento e do curso de pós-graduação. Em primeiro lugar, não é uma obra só minha, né? E nem mesmo principalmente minha, né? Seria preciso, nessa ocasião, relembrar, sobretudo, a Madre Laura, uma agostiniana, e foi, na realidade, graças a ela que eu e outros colegas eu vou mencionar alguns em seguida, fomos contratados na Faculdade Sede Sapiência, que elas mantinham, né, e que era dirigida, sobretudo, para as moças. E, de vez em quando, havia um ou outro candidato masculino. Então, os colegas que, na realidade, tiveram mais relevo, né, na criação do Departamento de Filosofia, tal como ele existe atualmente, que resultou da reunião do Departamento de Filosofia da Faculdade Sede Sapiência com o Departamento da Faculdade de São Bento, né? Então, da reunião desses dois departamentos é que resultou, por volta de 1971, o atual Departamento de Filosofia da PUC, né? E tiveram muita importância nessa ocasião, em primeiro lugar, a Madre Laura, né, que foi como que a possibilitadora de tudo isso, né? E outros colegas, a professora Salma, que ainda continua atuando no departamento e na própria universidade, mas também colegas que não estão mais aqui na PUC, né? O Lauro e a Lígia, que se transferiram para Marília, para a faculdade da Unesp, existente em Marília, e que a essas alturas já estão aposentados. Além deles, a Iraí, que era uma professora de lógica, né, irmã do Carone, que é crítico literário, né? A Iraí Carone, irmã do... Me falta no momento o primeiro nome do Carone. Então, eu participei desses eventos, né? Mas a minha atuação foi certamente muito mais modesta do que a desses colegas que eu acabo de mencionar. E a mesma coisa aconteceu na criação do pós-graduação de filosofia, bem mais tarde, né? Que só se tornou possível quando o departamento acolheu 2 professores da USP que tinham sido cassados pelo governo de então, né? O professor Janotti e o professor Bento Prado, que se integraram muito bem no departamento e contribuíram enormemente para a consistência do departamento nessa ocasião. Tudo isso a professora Salmo já contou, né, em duas publicações que foram feitas por ocasião do centenário do curso de filosofia que existia no São Bento, que depois se uniu com o curso do SEDES, né? Trata-se de uma publicação que tem como título Um Passado Revisitado. E há uma outra publicação mais recente, Filosofia, Memória, Educação e Cultura. Nessas 2 publicações, a professora Salma conta essa história muito mais detalhadamente, né? E fora do Departamento de Filosofia da PUC, né, eu, desde o início, né, tive uma participação naquilo que foi, primeiro, a Comissão de Filosofia Medieval brasileira, né, e e depois Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia Medieval. Mas aí também a minha atuação foi menos ativa, digamos assim, do que a de outros, né? Essa comissão de filosofia medieval começou, na realidade, com o professor José Antônio, que era professor na época em Goiânia e depois em Brasília. Ele que teve a ideia de algum modo, reunir os professores que no Brasil estudavam filosofia medieval. Ele promoveu uma reunião desses professores na Universidade de Brasília por volta de 1978, da qual eu não participei. Eu encontrei o Zé Antônio já depois dessa reunião. E havia, digamos, uma dezena de professores, né? E nem todos eram professores nas universidades. Alguns já eram gente aposentada ou exerciam outras atividades, né? Mas foi a partir dessa iniciativa do José Antônio que os professores de filosofia medieval começaram a se relacionar entre si e isso propiciou a situação atual do ensino de filosofia medieval no Brasil, em que, se não todas, mas um grande número de universidades tem a disciplina filosofia medieval, né? E nos departamentos de filosofia. Eu precisaria mencionar também, nesse sentido, o professor Deboni, o professor João Lupe, que nos acompanha aqui. Estou vendo a figura dele aqui nas janelas aqui do lado, né? Assim como outros professores, né? Tanto no Rio Grande do Sul, no Paraná, no Nordeste, o professor Marcos Nunes Costa. Então, o professor José Carlos Estevão usou uma expressão, não sei quando, acho que no concurso dele para professor titular, em que ele disse que o pessoal que trabalhava com história da filosofia medieval trabalhava preferentemente de modo coletivo. Isso é verdade, desde o início, né? Nenhum de nós era uma figura isolada. E acho que é a partir dessas modestas iniciativas, né, que começaram com o José Antônio, é que nós chegamos ao estado atual, né, do ensino de filosofia medieval no Brasil, que, digamos, pelo menos na minha opinião particular, vai muito bem. O que não quer dizer que não haja ainda muita coisa a fazer, né? Eu gostaria de terminar com uma expressão popular, né, que diz que, em certas situações, a gente deve agradecer a Deus e a todo mundo. E é o que eu faço, né? E, nesse sentido, eu digo obrigado, muito obrigado, um obrigadão. Merci, merci bien, merci beaucoup.
A pedido, então, do professor Carlos Arthur, nós vamos finalizar com uma música que ele nos solicitou e, na sequência, já finalizaremos definitivamente o evento. Meu muito obrigado.
Não estamos ouvindo, Luiz.
Só um momento.
Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me dio dos luceros que cuando los abro, perfecto distingo lo negro del blanco y en el alto cielo su fondo estrellado. En las multitudes el hombre que yo amo. Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me ha dado el oído, que en todo su ancho graba noche y día, grillos y canarios, martillos, turbinas, ladrillos, chubasco, y la voz tan tierna de mi bien amado. Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me ha dado el sonido y el abecedario, con él las palabras que pienso y declaro, padre, amigo, hermano, y luz alumbrando la ruta del alma del que estoy amando. Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me ha dado la marcha de mis pies cansados, con ellos anduve ciudades y charcos, playas y desiertos, montañas y llano, y la casa tuya, tu calle y tu patio. Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me dio el corazón que agita su marco cuando miro el fruto del cerebro humano, cuando miro el bueno tan lejos del malo, cuando miro el fondo de tus ojos claros. Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, dado la risa y me ha dado el llanto. Así yo distingo dicha de quebranto lodo material de tu formal, mi canto y el canto de ustedes que es un mismo canto, y el canto de todos es mi propio canto. Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto.